Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. It's game 5 of the World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Liren. The score is 2-2. Both players managed to win one game. Yesterday was a rest day, and today we have two fresh players ready to fight again. Today it's the Russian player Nepo who is playing with the white pieces, and for this occasion he decided to return to his favorite move 1e4, which he played in the first game of the match. And in the third game of the match, he actually played 1d4. But he had something very interesting in mind. Let's have a look. Liren plays again e5, and we will get to see the Spanish opening. Bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, white castles. And now after bishop e7, interesting moment, because in the first game, Nepo decided to play bishop takes c6 and actually got a promising position, although objectively it should not be too challenging for black. And here he played the move d3, which is also a deviation from the move rook e1, which he played 4 times in the World Championship match against Magnus Carlsen. But okay, d3 is on the board, b5, bishop b3, d6. And now the positional threat for black is to play knight a5, trying to win this bishop. And white doesn't want to surrender that light squared bishop, so plays the move c3, black castles. And now white goes for the move h3, which is interesting, as in 2 earlier games Magnus Carlsen played against Liren both the moves a4 and rook e1. But Nepo had something very clear in mind. He goes for the move h3, and black is for a choice. Black played the move bishop to b7. It should be said though that the most common move here is knight a5, forcing the bishop to go back to c2, and then there is c5. We have a sort of Chigorin classical setup against Ruy Lopez. But now after the move bishop b7, white plays the move a4. And the idea is that now after knight a5, the bishop can stay on this beautiful diagonal, retaining control over the light squares, particularly pressurizing the pawn on f7. Black goes c5, it's the consistent follow-up, and now we have almost left the existing theory. There's only one game. Last year, Alireza Firouzja played here the move knight a3 against Anish Giri in a tournament in Miami. But Nepo played the move bishop g5, and he was still blitzing out his moves. And also the next couple of moves were still part of his preparation. The idea is to trade off the bishop for the knight and to increase the control over the d5 square. That's going to play a very important factor in this game. There are various ways for black to play here, but Ding played the move h6. And now after bishop takes f6, white decided to release the tension with a takes b5, and the knight joins play. Knight bd2. Black also played in a very principled manner by coming back with a knight from a5 to c6. The knight had no longer anything to do there at the side of the board. And now the drawback of that move is, of course, that white can place its bishop safely on d5, maintaining a bit of pressure. And white is also ready to bring its queen to b3, to attack the pawn and increase the pressure on this diagonal. So for that reason, black decides to take on a1. The queen recaptures, and now queen d7. So black has abandoned the control over the a file, but is ready to come over with its rook whenever it's needed. And it seems like Nepo was still pretty much prepared for this sort of scenario. Played now the move rook to e1, with the idea of making space for the knight so that the knight can come via f1 to e3, from where it does control both the d5 and f5 square. And here Ding was already spending more than half an hour to figure out all the subtleties of this position, and eventually he decided to go for the move rook a8, very natural move. And now white goes queen d1. I think this is a very good move. So the queen is very flexible, and we don't really care about the a file. If it's needed, we can get our queen over to b3 to attack the pawn. But the queen is also looking for ideas to join a potential attack on the king side. And here we see that this bishop on f6, it's obstructed by its own pawns. It's not a good bishop. And for that reason, Ding decided to go bishop d8 now, trying to improve it by bringing it to b6. And white has a very simple plan to carry out. He goes knight f1, and black goes knight e7, offering the exchange of light squared bishops. Bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, and now the knight goes to e3. Very often in the Spanish opening, the knight goes to g3 as well, but I think the knight is in this case much nicer placed on these two squares. And you see that the knight on e7 has to stay there in order to prevent the white knight from entering. Black goes bishop b6. And now, interesting moment, because how is white going to increase the pressure on black? Well, the following move is a really classy one. It's the move h4. With the idea of coming forward with his pawn to h5. And later on, can you imagine that white is going to play knight h4 and knight f5, install a knight on f5, put a queen on g4, threatening mate on g7, just a bit of imagination. That would be the dream sort of setup. That knight on f5 can never be chased away by that pawn on g7, because that pawn on h5 really has a very unpleasant impact on black's king side. Here, black should not play the move h5 to prevent white from coming forward with the h-pawn, because it runs into knight g5, followed by queen b3 with a lot of pressure against both the pawn on b5 as well as the pawn on f7. Black played queen c6, though it should be said that maybe it would have been better to ignore all the actions on the king side. Play rook a2, go for counterplay, hitting the pawn, with the idea that after queen b3 you will proceed with queen a6, following it up with queen a4, initiating the exchange of queens, and that would be great because then the entire attack would not be that threatening. But okay, Ding decided differently, played queen c6, and white goes for the move h5. So the idea of the move queen c6 is that now c4 can be played. The queen protects the pawn on c4. And if white would decide to take on c4, you recapture with the b pawn, and this bishop is very nicely placed now. So instead, white goes for d4. That is an excellent move, with one of the main points being that the pawn on e4 cannot really be taken. If you take on e4, there is knight takes c4 with a discovered attack on the queen and bishop. And now after queen c6, you take the bishop, black recaptures, and now the pawn on e5 is just lost. Black decided here to take on d4, because white is actually threatening to take twice on e5. But maybe it would have been better to go rook d8, so that in case white would capture, you recapture and the rook is very nicely placed, hitting the queen on the d file. But Ding also played quite fast because he was under pressure. That was the strategy of Nepo, with a huge time advantage right out of the opening. He wants to put some practical problems for his opponent to solve over the board. Knight takes d4 played. And here now we are entering a very sharp stage of the game. Once again, the pawn on e4 cannot be taken on account of knight e to f5 with a discovered attack on the queen and the knight, so that drops material. Black played here queen c5, but the drawback of this move is that the bishop can no longer eliminate one of these knights. So in hindsight, maybe the move queen b7 would have been a better idea, with the idea that if you would take the pawn, there is bishop takes e3, and if white recaptures, the knight can be taken on b5. White isn't obliged to take on b5, obviously, but in that case, black has the possibility of either trading off the bishop for the knight on d4 or the knight on e3, and then the threats against the black king will be much easier for black to deal with that. So queen c5 on the board. Let's see what happens, because now things are really heating up, despite the fact that in Astana, where the match is taking place, it is like minus 10 degrees or so. So that's not very pleasant for the players. No opportunities to go outside, but fire on the board. So that's cool stuff. Let's see. Nepo played here the most natural move, queen to g4, with the idea of installing a knight on f5 and threatening to deliver mate, but definitely he overlooked this move queen e5, which is a great defensive resource. Apparently, the move queen f3 would have been better now, with ideas to prepare e5 with a discovered attack on the rook. And if you would play queen e5, which is not the most optimal move, there is knight g4. The knight can also go to that square, with the point that in case of queen takes h5, there is knight f6 with a discovered check, you're winning the queen. Instead, there are other possibilities. Maybe rook e8 is a more stubborn move. Even queen g5 could be considered as well. But queen g4 is a very natural move, a human decision. But after queen e5, black is still fighting here. And well, one of the ideas is, of course, also to trade off this bishop for a potential attacker. In case of knight f5, by the way, there is knight takes, threatening to take on h6 as the pawn on g7 is pinned, but black has king h7. So white instead played here the move knight f3, but now the queen is very nicely placed in the center, offering the exchange of queens, and black is doing okay. He has consolidated its position, and the bishop on b6 is also doing well. So of course the exchange of queens would only ease black's defensive task. White played knight f5, threatening mate on g7, and black decided to take on f5. Very understandable move, although queen f6 may have been a bit more flexible as the e-file remains closed. But instead, okay, Dink tries to force the issue here with knight takes f5, e takes f5, attacking the queen. And now we get to see a very serious mistake by black, as he played here the move queen f6. But the queen is not doing well here, and now white does get the chance to gain control over the center by moving the queen to e4. This is an excellent move. What should black have done instead? Well, it's the move queen d7. The f-pawn is pinned, so white has no chance to play f6, as the queen would be hanging. And in case of queen e4, attacking the rook in the corner, black has d5. And now the pawn gets mobilized, and possibly the bishop can be rerouted again back to the king side to f6, so that you're controlling any potential pawn sacrifices, and the bishop is guarding the king, while at the same time tries to exert pressure on the queen side against these pawns on b2 and c3. But let's have a look. Queen f6 played, and now queen e4. Excellent move, attacking the rook. And look, this rook can never be activated. There is queen c6, threatening the bishop. If the bishop goes to c5, there's rook e8 check, king h7, and now queen c8. The major pieces of white are forming a battery on the back rank. Rook h8 is the decisive mating threat, and black is collapsing here. So black played here the move rook b8. Very understandable, and I guess this was part of Dink's plan. His idea is now to prepare b4. So in case, let's say you play a move like queen d5, the idea is to go b4. Trying to win the pawn on b2 in case white is going to capture. You take on b2, threatening the pawn on f2 as well with queen and bishop. And if you take on c4, well, there's bc3, bc3, and we get rid of that very annoying pawn on f5. So a very natural move here would also be g4. But the problem with that move is that black is going to play b4 as well. And after queen takes c4, okay, the pawn on f5 is defended now by the pawn on g4. But you go b takes c3, and after, well, queen takes c3, there would be bishop takes f2. That's a remarkable tactical shot, hitting the king and rook. If you do take with the king, there's rook takes b2, check, and the queen will be lost. So you got to take back with the pawn. But here, after the move d5, queen takes d5, queen takes c3, white is a pawn up, but everything is on only one wing. So that means that there are very good drawing chances here for black. But the move played by Nepo, it's fantastic World Championship material. He played the move rook to e2, prophylactical move, anticipating black's idea, as he does overprotect the pawn on b2, preventing black from carrying out that pawn break b4, because the pawn can just be taken. That's why the move bishop c5 is played, trying to prepare b4 once again, but white plays g4, another fantastic move, as the pawn protects the pawn on f5. So b4 is not possible. There will be queen takes c4, and after b takes c3, b takes c3. Okay, this offers much better practical winning chances for white with pawn still on the board. So black decided to play differently. Played here the move queen to d8, hoping to get in the move d5. But white plays another fantastic prophylactical move. The queen sits down in the center, cannot be kicked out. And white has a huge practical advantage because black's pawn majority is immobile. And that pawns on the king side are really threatening. Ding played king f8. And white came up with another fantastic idea because he would like to improve its king. He played the move king f1. He could also have played king g2, but then the king is standing in this diagonal, or if you ever push your f-pawn and black attacks the pawn on g4 with the queen, then you can see that the king is not doing that well on g2. So that explains the move king f1. And I think black is in deep trouble because there are hardly any good moves. For instance, if you play a move like queen d7, there is fantastic shot knight e5. Attacking the queen, the knight cannot be taken as the d pawn is pinned. If you would go away with the queen to c7 now, look at this move, knight g6 check. Fantastic killer idea with the point that after f takes g6 you recapture with the f pawn, and look at the king. The king is caught in the middle, cannot go anywhere, and white has ideas of going rook e4, rook f4, and it's leading to a mating attack. This bishop on c5 is unable to help out. It's just one of the many typical attacking ideas in this line, and the same can be said also for the immediate move queen c7. That would run into f6. A fantastic pawn break. After g takes f6, the queen comes back to d2, hitting the pawn on h6. And after king g7, there is knight h4, followed by knight f5. And then the queen and knight are hitting together that pawn on h6. So you see how difficult it is for black to do something. The queen cannot really move. But it should have gone to c8 instead. Very difficult move. The idea is now that after the move f6, you cannot really go queen takes g4 because of rook e7. And look at this pawn. It supports the rook, and there's not much you can do against queen takes f7 with mate. The pawn can be taken, though, on f6. But after queen e4, the queen threatens to come inside. King g8, knight h4. Looks really dangerous with knight f5 coming, but black still has queen b7. Incredibly difficult to find. Now black is forcing the exchange of queens, and it's leading to mate if you avoid it. So you have to play this endgame in which white is better, but whether it's winning, I'm not sure. In the game there followed the move rook c8, and after this move there followed rook e4. Fantastic idea, keeping an eye on this pawn on c4, but also there's a hidden tactic. If black would play f6 to rule out white's idea of playing f6, there is knight h4, and that leads to mate, so that cannot be played. If you would play queen f6, looks like a very natural move, there would follow g5. That's the idea, and now we see the point of this rook on e4. It comes to g4, and you're threatening to take with a knight, and then knight takes g5, knight h7, and so on. Queen h6, knight takes g5, threatening mate. If you go queen takes h5, look at this fantastic resource. It's the move f6. With the point the rook cannot be taken, of course, as the queen no longer covers the f7 square. But if you do capture the pawn instead, there is knight e6 with a discovered check. You're winning the queen. So white is completely dominating on the light squares. Very typical strategy dealing with a dark squared bishop. This bishop is useless. Black played rook b8. And now the move g5 played. And the pressure is immense. This is really difficult to defend as black. Apparently the best move here is queen d7, allowing white to take on h6 and then put a knight on h2. Maybe there are still drawing chances after the queens will come off the board. But the endgame is still very unpleasant as the knight comes in, hitting the pawn on h6. Black instead took on g5, but that's a decisive mistake. There is rook g4, a big shot, threatening to take the pawn on g5 with a knight. So then you will threaten mate on f7. The big point is that if you go for the move f6, white has this fantastic shot of knight h4. When the knight is about to enter, the knight cannot be taken because of h6, and white is breaking through eventually. After g takes h6, it's leading to mate with the queen and rook. And after any other move, there's either h6, g7 or h7 with the threat of promoting the pawn. Ignoring the knight is not an option because after king e8, there is rook e4, king d7, knight g6, and thanks to the help of the knight, the rook will come to e7. Back to the game, as Ding played now the move rook a8, but after knight takes g5, rook a1 check, white still has a powerful attack while the rook is not threatening that much. There followed king e2, king g2 would also have been a good move, with the idea that after queen a8, queen takes, rook takes, you have the move f6 still when you're trying to break through. But this is, for a human eye, much harder to find. I think Nepal's move is much more understandable. The king is safe on e2. After queen e7, the knight comes back to e4. And now, look, you cannot do anything with this rook from a1. If you go rook b1, intending to take, white has the move f6, opening up the g file, threatening the queen. Black is allowed to take on b2 with check. It's just one check. King goes away. And after g takes f6, we have queen a8, queen e8 only move. And now we have the deflection motive with rook g8, king takes, and queen takes e8, winning the queen. Fantastic line. And that means that f6 is a huge threat in general. If you try to stop it with f6, white will go h6 once again, and the pawn cannot be taken because of checkmate. What else can black do? That is not clear. Queen e5 is never a possibility to offer the exchange of queens because white is going to take it and just collect the bishop on c5. Very convincing line. Queen e8 played, and now before anything else, white improves the king so that the knight is able to move as well. One of the ideas is to go f6, and if the pawn captures, there is knight takes f6, and the knight joins the attack, and well, there are ideas with rook g8 and try to deliver mate. Black's last chance here was queen a8, but that's leading nowhere. After queen takes a8, rook takes a8, the endgame is definitely lost. There is f6, and the main point here is that after g takes f6, this h-pawn is unstoppable. After knight takes f6, white threatens rook g8 and to pick up the rook. If the king goes away first, we can just play knight g8, and after king f8, h6, h7, and h8, queen is decisive. One final try, f5, rook g6, and if the rook now tries to stop the pawn, we have knight f6, and there's nothing black can do against h7 and h8 queen. So that's why black, instead of capturing on f6, decided to try to keep things close, but the position is dead lost. F g6, rook takes g6, and this pawn is simply too strong, as it can count on the support of knight, rook, and king. Look, after rook a2, white played here the move king to g4, excellent move. After rook takes b2, white played another fantastic move, rook h6, so that if black plays something like rook e2 to attack the knight, we have the move king f5, and the king is absolutely safe. Black cannot do anything, the bishop is out of play, and if you play b4, it's rook h8, king f7, knight g5 with checkmate. Look at this fantastic coordination of white's pieces. Absolutely amazing. Any other lines also don't really help. For instance, if you go b4 immediately, we can give a check on h8 first, and after king f7, we have king f5 with reverse tactical idea. Now, white is threatening checkmate with a knight. Black can only give up the rook on f2, knight takes, bishop takes, rook h7, and anyway, this king, pawn, and rook our decisive threatening mate, or the f-pawn will queen. So for that reason, after the move rook h6, Ding had seen enough. And what an amazing performance by Nepo, bouncing back from that loss before the rest day. He is now in the lead, 3 versus 2, and that's maybe something we would not have expected. But what we can learn from this match, a lot of things. So many action, tactical ideas we have seen, but also we have already seen 3 decisive games. And I would not be surprised if Ding is capable of bouncing back. He has proved it already early in the match, so it's everything far from over. It's 3-2 now for Nepo. Let's see what will bring game 6 for us. See you then.